You are listening to the Lawyer Stories podcast with host Benny Gold. Lawyer Stories was founded in July 2017 on Instagram and is an expanding global network of lawyers and law students sharing their personal journeys to the noble profession of the practice of law. Join us on this podcast as we dig deeper into these stories and hear from lawyers and law students from around the world in all areas of the legal profession. Here at Lawyer Stories, we believe that every lawyer has a story. What's yours?
Welcome to episode 8 of the Lawyer Stories podcast with Benny Gold. Today, we welcome Haley Moss to the show. Haley's a leader on disability inclusion, autism, and neurodiversity in the workplace, employment policy, accessibility, and lawyers with disability. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you for having me this morning.
Yes, of course. It's great to have you. And before we get started, I just wanted to give our well wishes to everybody out there. I hope you're feeling healthy, being responsible, and social distancing, washing your hands, and doing what we all need to do to flatten the curve and continue to see things progress during this global pandemic. It's such an unfortunate situation out there. So we really want to get through this this global pandemic. So with that said, welcome again, Haley. Thanks for being with us. Haley has a very interesting story. She was the first open. I think it was open. That's the term you used.
Yeah, is the term that we've seen floating around a lot is openly autistic.
Openly autistic attorney sworn in last January. So we're actually recording the show in April. So April 2nd, 2020 was World Autism Awareness Day, and this April happens to be Autism Awareness Month. So for those of us who might not be familiar, what is autism and how does it affect you?
All right. So this is definitely a big question to answer. And I'm really glad that we're doing this for Autism Awareness Month. So every April is Autism Awareness Month. Every April 2nd is World Autism Awareness Day. So those are things to keep in mind on your calendar each year when we have these discussions. It's definitely a funky time doing it in the middle of a pandemic. But a little bit about autism, if you're not so familiar, I always say everybody eventually knows somebody, or if you don't know somebody, you know someone right now. So autism, generally speaking, is a developmental and neurological disability that is fairly common. It affects about 1 in 54 people in the United States per recent CDC numbers that came out a couple weeks ago, actually. It keeps going up, and that's not the scary bad thing that I think everyone thinks it is. It just means we're getting better at identifying people across, because it affects people of all genders, all races, all socioeconomic statuses. It doesn't discriminate. So I really like to make that clear right off the bat. I think autism mostly affects people in terms of development, social skills, sensory profiles, all these different things into how we process and interpret the world. I think it looks different in every single person. So if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've literally met one autistic person. So for me, the things that I struggle the most with are independent living skills. So I am someone who's really bad at cooking and cleaning and laundry and things like that, which sounds like a lot of young adults, but the way that I like to describe that is that it's not that I don't want to do it. It's that going through some of the cognitive steps can be very overwhelming and figuring out like, wait, there are so many different cleaners. There's so much this, there's so much that it could be a lot to process sometimes.
Right.
Also, for me, things like knowing when to start and stop things, which kind of goes in there too. I also feel like I experience the world on overdrive in terms of sensory. So sensory overloads happen a lot. But the big thing that has been pretty prevalent throughout my entire life as well has mostly been like social skills and making friends. So a lot of social skills are not natural, at least the ones that the neurotypical people, which is people who are not autistic, seem to have, that you just know innately. So the best way to describe this, and the best example I've had throughout my life, is most people know if you roll your eyes, that probably means you're bored when I'm talking to you. And someone had to tell me, hey, if someone rolls their eyes at you, they're probably bored. Like, it just didn't click. I would have never picked up on that if no one
Picking
told
up on
me.
that. Who would do that though? Who's going to roll their eyes at you when you're talking to them? Like if you're, I mean, unless you're saying something sort of negative to them, I guess. But
I mean, when you're little, you don't realize when people are just bored with what you're saying, or they don't want to hear about whatever the thing is that interests you the most.
got it. What about? I know we've touched on like an example of like feeling overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can go back and talk about that a little bit, like just to sort of give us a clear picture of what that feels like.
Yeah, so I think with sensory overloads and with feeling overwhelmed, the easiest way that I like to make it accessible to people who might have never had this experience before is imagine being in a Target or Walmart and you're in the electronics aisle and all the TVs are on, they're all on different channels, and the volume is on. And then, because I'm that person, I'm going to tell you to focus on just one of them. Is focus on one of the volume and one of the pictures. And you're probably going to feel very overwhelmed and anxious at the idea of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're trying to tune out all the other input from all the other TVs and the other volume and everything that's going on. It's a lot of stimuli to kind of take in, and you just feel very overwhelmed and tired from it in a way that you wouldn't expect to. And that's the sensation that I can get just navigating the world sometimes. And for me, I can feel that a lot, especially in places that are loud and crowded. So most people know that for me, loud and crowded usually means like certain concerts or certain like large gatherings, things like that. So concerts are kind of the place that I've always noticed it, especially if jazz music is involved. And I feel like for me that just the way that the saxophone sounds really just makes me very overwhelmed. It's very loud. It's just the way. No disrespect to those of you who are saxophone fans or sax players, because you are wonderful and gifted. I just can't physically handle it. So that doesn't mean that I don't love you.
I don't know. Kenny G might be listening to this right now. I think he's a saxophonist. Is that correct? Okay. Well, that's a very good example. And I think when we were talking offline, you were telling me about once you went to a concert and maybe at school, and it was pretty overwhelming, and the person you were with could kind of tell that you were a little overwhelmed at that point. So you went viral last year when you were sworn in as Florida's first openly autistic attorney. That was in January. And I know shortly thereafter we got a hold of you and we featured you on Lawyer Stories. So like, what was that like? So when you went viral, I mean, this was like a pretty big deal. I mean, you were picked up by CNN, Newsweek, People, U.S. News, New York Post, and like the list goes on. So, like, what was that like, and like, what have you been, what have you been up to since then?
So what it was like, it was a huge adventure. I was not prepared for it. So here's the thing: is what happened at first is our local lawyer newspaper and my local newspaper covered my swearing in. So it was in our South Florida Sun Sentinel, and also the business-to-business publication of the Daily Business Review. So law.com for those of you who subscribe to these things. And what happened is I was at an event probably like 2 or 3 weeks later, and all of a sudden I go to the bathroom and I look at my phone, because as one does, and I see that like my Twitter feed is blowing up and I don't understand why.
Wow.
And I realize that the AP got a hold of the story.
Okay.
And before I knew it, every station or like Fox affiliate, The Hill, this one, that one, they were all like in my DMs asking for permission to use my photos. And I was like at this event with my mom, and I'm like, Mom, something happened. And she's like, what's going on? And I was explaining the AP got the story, and like every single Fox channel is asking if they can use my pictures from Instagram.
Yep.
And we were just enjoying our night at this event, and I was the honoree that night. It was really wonderful. And then it was President's Day weekend.
Right.
So everything was blowing up. I remember calling my supervisor and being like, so the story went viral. Every single news station wants in on this. And they're like, just handle it. And
really, they were just like, handle it?
They thought it was wonderful. And they're like, handle it. And I ended up I was scared. I was like kind of nervous at first, because I'm like, this is really big. And it took maybe about 2 or 3 weeks to handle all the different inquiries and to line them up and people coming to our house because I was home with my family for President's Weekend and this event.
So did you like respond to them right away, like when you were at the event, being an honoree, or did you wait a night, or did you like?
I waited until the next morning because it was a Saturday night. So I waited until Sunday morning, and by Monday, which was President's Day, everything was just going wild.
Right.
So it took probably about 2 to 3 weeks at least before I was able to go back into the office and just have things kind of somewhat return to normal. And to an extent, I was still doing interviews. I was still trying to line everything up because it was all on me at the time. And it was really, really wild. It was a lot of fun. You don't realize how much goes into things like that. And the big culmination was the Today Show at the time. And it ended in a really awesome 6-minute video and an article that I absolutely adored. And it took over 2 days to shoot.
Okay.
It was that they came with me to work. They came to my apartment. They came to my parents' house. I met the crew again when I did an event in Jacksonville a couple weeks later. It was a lot that went into it. It was very exhausting to think about this whole process. I'm like, wow, how did I have the energy for all this?
Yeah, I mean, so Haley, I do want to speak to that 6-minute video on Today because I did watch that, and I just want to give a shout out to your parents because they seem like they're pretty awesome and supportive people. I mean, obviously, since day one, telling you this is your superpower, like you're gonna, this is what you can achieve, and just never doubting you, like that you can, do anything you want, and you could tell just by the way that they were talking in that video that, they obviously just believe in you, like and any parent should, but it's so nice and refreshing to see that.
They are truly the best.
Yeah,
I love my family. I'm the only kid, so they're stuck with me, but my parents are genuinely amazing. They're the best. I could sit here all day and tell you how wonderful they are.
Yep.
So thank you for giving them the shout out that they deserve, because they deserve 50 million shout outs. And I also love how completely respectful of me they are with this whole process. When we were talking about going viral, is we would have discussions as a family, like, what are our boundaries? What do we feel comfortable talking about together? What do we not feel comfortable sharing? So we always were very consistent, because what happens as well with disability narratives that we know that most people notice in the news, and I notice this too, is when you read these stories or you watch them, you realize who is the story about, who is the audience, and who is missing. And a lot of the time, you don't see the people with disabilities actually getting to talk or the story really being about them. It's usually about the parents. It's usually about the friends. So as you mentioned, we're recording in April, and normally this would have been prom season. And every single prom season, you usually see some kind of heartwarming or supposed to be heartwarming story about someone with prom.
Yeah.
And, you see a high school quarterback taking the kid with Down syndrome to prom.
Right.
And whenever they do these interviews and these stories, you realize they always talk to the quarterback's parents, the student with Down syndrome's parents, but they don't talk to the person with Down syndrome. And I always think it's really interesting. I'm like, what if this kid didn't even want to go to prom? What if they just wanted to go to prom with their friends?
Right.
And I actually saw it again in a story about the pandemic locally of someone with Down syndrome who recovered from COVID, and they only talked to the hospital staff and the young woman's mother. And I'm like, I want to know how she felt. I want to know if she was scared. I want to know how she felt in the hospital and things like that. So I'm really grateful that my parents are supportive and will pass the mic to me if they're offered it too. And also that when I was doing a lot of media and going viral, people always wanted to talk to me. And I wonder how much of that does come with the privilege of having a law degree. So it's something that I'm very grateful for, and also why I continue to write, and I'll write an op-ed about my story as well, because I want to be in control of what gets said and what narrative and what stories I have to tell that matter. Because sometimes, as you know, with media, again, like I mentioned with the Today Show, it took over 2 to 3 days of filming and you only saw 6 minutes.
Yeah.
So you don't really get the full picture. So sometimes if I get the chance to illustrate it, I will do the best I can to tell a story that I think is important rather than what might fit nicely into 2 minutes. Because, well, like when you watch the news, most TV spots are maybe 2 minutes tops. So it's like, what do you want to say? And when you have the opportunity.
And that's, that's what we promote here on Lawyer Stories, like we want to hear it right from you. And really thank you again for getting back to us and being willing to share your story. That was pretty amazing.
I love getting to talk to lawyers.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Although sometimes it's still kind of intimidating when you're still like a newer lawyer. You're like, oh my God, what if they don't know? What if I don't sound like I know what I'm doing or
Yeah,
what I'm talking about? Like, it's kind of intimidating sometimes.
yeah, I hear you. It can be, but I don't know. It's not something to really worry about. You're fine.
I try not to. I realize there are things and experiences that I have that other lawyers might not have, and there are
Right.
things that I know from lived experience or feel like I might be an expert in. So even with going viral and being openly autistic, I was telling you this offline as well, is I end up sometimes being in this reverse mentorship situation where I hear from attorneys who have been in practice way longer than I have been, who are also autistic and might not have said something, and they're asking for me advice about disclosure, about how to navigate certain situations and things like that. And it makes me feel really empowered, realizing is sometimes as intimidating as lawyers who are more senior or have more experience can be at times, especially for new lawyers and recent grads, that I had this experience that maybe they didn't, and it was able to empower them and that they were able to learn something from me too. So
Yeah, I mean, it
I
comes.
realize on this journey, I definitely learn a lot, and I really feel great that I can both teach people and learn at the same time. So I'm both the teacher and the student.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it definitely takes time, but one thing I've learned is like a lot of times people talk like they know what they're talking about, but in reality they don't. I mean, it's just the way that
Mm-hmm.
their inflection and the confidence that they have in their speech. But that's probably a story for another day. Um, but yes, I do. I think that's great that you're able to be the student and the teacher in your situation because a lot of people don't really know about it or what you went through or how you see the world.
Absolutely. And I
Especially
feel like
like
we don't
me.
talk about lawyers with disabilities enough in general. So it's
Right.
something that I'm trying to continue the conversation on and get it going. So I'm really lucky that like this past year I've been able to serve as a co-chair on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee on my local chapter of the Florida Association for Women Lawyers. I'm going to be hopefully serving in some capacity with the Florida Bar next year with helping on inclusion things. So I'm really excited to get to keep serving our profession because it is a conversation we don't have beyond mental health. And as you know, there are plenty of mental health task force throughout the profession. So we see that, but it's really exciting to get to take disability further.
That's great. And that was actually, one of my next questions is, what's the legal profession like as an autistic person? And, what would you like to see change? Like, hopefully you will have the ability to make some changes, get some changes going with your new roles with the Florida Bar, if you
Absolutely.
work with them.
So I think I think people are generally very supportive and genuinely want to help. I think I've been incredibly fortunate that people have been very nice. A lot of other lawyers are. And I think what I've noticed as well is that I will often hear from lawyers that are usually parents of autistic kids or adults or their adult kids at that point, because sometimes they have kids who are my age and they're not always 100% sure what to make of the situation when they talk to me because they're trying to figure out, am I like their children or am I their colleague? So they're trying to figure out which box to place me in, and then they realize that I can be both. And it's so invaluable getting to both be in their space, both personally and professionally at the same time. And I think what I'm hoping to see in terms of accessibility in the profession is it's something that people should be mindful of. I remember talking to one of the lawyers I was working with, and he mentioned to me, I've been a litigator for like 25 years, and I've never seen a lawyer in a wheelchair in any of the times I went to court.
Hmm.
I don't even know, or I don't recall ever seeing a deaf lawyer. We were having this discussion one day over lunch, and I was thinking, you bring up a really good point. And of course, me being the ever researcher, wanting to know everything about everything,
Yep.
goes down the rabbit hole, right? I actually wrote a book chapter about lawyers with disabilities, especially young lawyers, because it's just fascinating to me seeing how younger lawyers and millennials tend to be more open about disability and mental health, and our generation kind of wants to destigmatize everything. So I think it's super interesting seeing that evolution. But I think what I want to see in the profession in terms of accessibility, I would love to see more interpreters. I'd love to see more remote work options too. I know that obviously with the pandemic, we're seeing a lot more things happening over Zoom. We're seeing a lot more remote things happen. I'd love to see that be as accessible as possible. And I think we're learning that we aren't necessarily great at giving guidance and advice. So you've probably seen some of the news stories about people showing up to court hearings in their pajamas.
Or like they aren't wearing shirts or somebody under the covers or something like that. I
Exactly. Like, think
did
how
read
much
about
all of us would
that.
benefit if we were told beforehand that this is a Zoom meeting. It is over video. It's not just audio. Please dress in court attire. Like, think of how much we would all benefit if we just were told that flat out.
Right. And I mean, it's unbelievable. And all this stuff, by the way, happens, all this funny and funky stuff happens in Florida. That's how it looks like when I'm in Massachusetts. So that's kind of how it looks like.
I always get that feeling. And then I realize, and then when funky things happen in Florida, I always go to see what county it's in. So then I know how bad I should feel about it. So that's what happens when you live in Florida. So you see Florida man stories, or you see crazy funky Florida stories, and you go, okay, is that in South Florida, Central Florida, or North Florida, or Tampa? You're like trying to figure it out. But I think that if we had those guidelines kind of spelled out, I know for autistic people, it's really hard to like read between the lines, and I like having that clear instruction. But think how much all of us would have benefited if we were all told, this is the decorum for a Zoom meeting. This is what you should be doing. This is what we expect of you.
Right.
And I don't mean that to kind of be a stickler, and maybe it's common sense to some people, but I think that when it comes to accessibility, it's really not just for people with disabilities. It's for everybody. And when we help people who are the most marginalized in some way, we're able to help everybody at the same time. So think about even like the curb cut effect with sidewalks. So what was originally designed for people with disabilities and wheelchairs and things like that ends up benefiting people who are walking and crossing the street. It helps cars. It helps everybody.
Right.
So kind of this idea is when we help make things accessible at the level of people who struggle the most, so people with disabilities in this case, it genuinely benefits everybody. Like, I know anyone can benefit from having additional things spelled out, or maybe even having captions on a video, because how many of us actually watch TV with the captions on because other people are making noise or things like that too. So I always think about captioning when it comes to things, even transcribing different podcasts. So I'm always a stickler on transcription, for instance, because sometimes it's really hard for me, or I'll miss an audio cue. But if I can read it, I will probably remember it, or I'll be able to go back and highlight something that mattered to me. Things like, so there's all sorts of like little tiny things that I realize we could be doing better. And it's just really fun getting to see it come together at this point.
Right. So I work with, like I have a quasi state and local job, and I, as executive director of public housing authorities, and I have to approve reasonable accommodations. So I see that all the time. And like when you can alter a rule or make a reasonable modification, it really can help somebody live their life, the way that everybody else, can. So everybody has an equal playing ground. So it's very important. I definitely respect and hear what you're saying. There is one word that is used a lot when I did a little research, and I was hoping you could explain it for me. The term neurodiversity.
Ooh, neurodiversity is probably one of my favorite words ever. I feel guilty that I didn't discover it earlier, and it was actually coined in the late 90s. I was researching this last night because I'm working on something about neurodiversity more generally. Okay. And it's an umbrella term pretty much that's used to describe different types of variations in the brain and neurological functions. So it's kind of like this idea that differences in our brains exist, kind of like biodiversity, that we have different species, we have different stuff going on. And neurodiversity really speaks to people who might have been diagnosed with autism, learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, all these different types of things that make our brains different. So I think developmental, learning, intellectual, certain psychiatric, and it's just a different way of experiencing the world, and that our brains are different. But that's not a bad thing. That's just something that needs to be accepted, and something that's naturally occurring in part of our society as is, and part of our species. So I think of it as a super interesting concept. And what we see in this broader neurodiversity movement is this push towards inclusion and equal civil rights. So as we know, we have a lot of talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, like you've mentioned, with reasonable accommodations. Yep. So everything kind of plays together. So even though this is happening a lot from a public policy standpoint, what I notice what goes on in neurodiversity, other than just autistic people and people with ADHD and dyslexia and all these other conditions coming together and saying, hi, we're people, please treat us like people, and please accept us, and realize that we have benefit to society and we add to society. You see this whole other civil rights revolution going on at the same time.
Wow. Okay. So very interesting stuff. So like, how can we be better allies to people on the autism spectrum, and colleagues who have disabilities or neurodivergent, as you would call it? Like,
Mhm.
how can we be better to people?
I think it's great, first off, that we're having this conversation, because I feel like what happens is a lot of conversations about disability and neurodiversity sort of happen in an echo chamber. So they happen with people who are usually touched by it in some way, like their family members, personal experience, professionals, that there's some kind of personal connection. So when we have those conversations, we're like, yeah, duh, it all bounces off each other. But when we have it with allies or people who might have no connection whatsoever, and they're like, oh my God, we can do more. There's so much that we need to learn. I feel like we're really opening the gates, and then we're able to do better. So listening is probably the biggest thing that I always advocate for, is being a good listener. I know for me, I learn a lot because there are different experiences that I don't have, that it's up to me to be better as an advocate, because I only know my own experience. I have no idea what it's like to be a guy. I have no idea what it's like to be a person of color. I don't know what it's like to be LGBTQ. So I don't know any of those other intersections as well. So that's kind of how I take my approach to advocacy, is when I don't have that experience, I find someone who does, and I pass the mic and be like, I'm just going to listen. So I think it's really important that we elevate voices who have these experiences. We create spaces where people with disabilities in the profession feel comfortable sharing. And I say that because a lot of people with mental health conditions, especially, I also like to clarify when we talk about mental health that autism is not mental illness, but we also, and a lot of disability is not mental health, but they could exist at the same time. And I think what happens is a lot of people don't disclose or don't talk about these things because our profession is very competitive and has this feeling of, you don't want to admit signs of weakness. But it isn't necessarily a weakness if we're talking and opening discussion. It shows that we're human, that we're vulnerable. And also, in terms of neurodivergence, that there's a lot of us who have really great strengths and talents. So I get to talk about neurodiversity at work all the time. And what we've seen in terms of data and from different companies that purposely will recruit neurodiverse talent is that they're companies that are making more money, that they have higher shareholder returns, the public loves them, they have all this great stuff happening, and they're solving problems. You see really good stuff happening.
Yeah,
And people need to think about that stuff rather than just, oh my God, we might have to make an accommodation, and get past that fear of the unknown. And I think fear of the unknown is the thing that kind of rules for potential allies, is they're afraid of what they don't know. And I think that's an experience any of us can have, really, is that we're afraid of something we don't understand. Is it going to be expensive? What do I do? And my advice is just be a good listener and listen to as many different voices as you can. So listen to personal experiences like mine or other people. I know there's plenty of awesome neurodivergent lawyers that I'm aware of and that I've spoken to over the past couple of years. So there's lots going on. There's tons of people to learn from, whether it's parents, professionals, personal experiences, researchers. There's so much, and take in as much information as you can, and then we can do something actionable.
wow, that's amazing. So, um, wow, okay, so I really just have one other question I wanted to ask you, and this is a lot of information, Haley, and I really appreciate it. You're a very impressive young lady.
Thank you.
So tell us about. I see that you're into art and
Mm-hmm.
written a couple books. Can you just touch on that briefly?
Absolutely. So I'm one of those people that absolutely is awkward about promoting themselves, so bear with me.
Okay.
Um, I just like to be able to pass things along, and I'm not like, because I feel like what happens with a lot of authors and stuff, they're always like, buy my stuff. And I'm also like, here's what I can do. I want to educate you. So that's it's just a very different approach to things. But
Okay.
I wrote my first book, Middle
Yep.
School, The Stuff Nobody Tells You About, when I was in high school, actually, because I went to 3 schools in 3 years.
Okay.
So I was definitely one of those people who had 3 very different experiences. And I think middle school kind of is everybody's collective awkward phase. So
Yeah.
I wanted to really write something that would resonate with as many people as possible to get through it. And my kind of approach to writing generally has always been, if I can help one person with whatever advice or whatever I've been through that I can, it's all worth it.
Yep.
So I was really glad that I got to do it the first time. And that was the first time I got to be on TV, really, as I was on CNN after the book came out. And I
So,
realized I was able to help a ton of people, and I got all these emails and all this stuff, and I was like 15 thinking this was the best, and I was able to help so many people, and I wanted to keep doing that, and it felt almost like greedy, but I also wanted to just help everybody. And when I was going to college, I wanted resources for myself because I've never even been to sleepaway camp, let alone lived in a dorm, so I was totally clueless. and I've never had that experience of being totally independent before. So I wanted to see what was out there by autistic people for autistic people, and everything on college at the time was primarily written by parents and student support people. And I'm like, what about, I want to know that it's doable. I want to hear from someone who, graduated or is in it. So that's the role that I took, because I started writing right after my freshman year. And we ended up with the freshman survival guide for college students with autism spectrum disorders. I'm also currently working on another book or two, hopefully to get written while we're staying at home. I will give more details as I have them.
Excellent.
I also illustrated middle school, the stuff nobody tells you about, and got to illustrate the cover of the anthology, What Every Autistic Girl Wishes Her Parents Knew, which is about autistic women giving advice to parents, which is usually not what we see. We usually see lots of parent-to-parent advice. So it was really cool getting to be part of that book, contribute an original essay, and also get to illustrate the cover. So art has always been kind of my creative release. When I was in law school, people knew me as the artist at first. I remember in 1L year, we were talking about law school before, but here's a fun story from my 1L year, is my art page on Facebook, people kind of saw it, and one of my classmates comes up to me and goes, "Why didn't you just go to art school?"
Yeah.
And I was like, because I went to law school. Like, I didn't know what to say. I was like 21 and new and wanted to make friends and wasn't sure what to really do.
Right.
And she was like, "But you're so talented." And it was really funny, and I kind of laughed it off. We were friends throughout my entire law school career after that, actually. Awesome. And my identity as the artist kind of helped when I was in law school, because that's what people knew me as. And whenever there were creative projects, people loved to ask me to help with them. So
Great.
When we had a professor who had a medical emergency and had to take a leave for a couple of weeks, I was the one that the student body, not the student body, the Student Bar Association, but I can't talk today. So the SBA rep from my 1L section was like, "Hi, we really want to make a card, like a big poster to send to this professor. Can you do it?" And I was like, okay, this makes me feel really cool. And I remember not doing the reading that night and putting together this beautiful poster and drawing it and doing like a get well soon, our thoughts are with you. And the next day I bring it into class and the senator's like, "Well, I want everyone to sign it." And I'm like, okay, great. And I remember busting out about 2 packages of markers, like artist markers, not like markers that you would just see from like the elementary school supply section, but like artist markers, like serious markers with 2 tips on each side in every color, like 80 different colors.
Okay.
And I just lay them out on the table with the poster and say, "Here, everybody can grab a different colored marker and sign it, because otherwise if everyone just signs it in black and blue pen, it will make my work look weird."
Yeah.
Like I was that person. And it was because I wanted it to be beautiful and creative even after everybody made their mark on it. And it was just really funny. And that was a moment a lot of my classmates remembered, is that not only did we have this really cool piece of artwork, but I was such a stickler about having all the different markers, because it was just the creative juices of it. I'm like,
cool.
And everyone, of course, was fascinated. Like, these are like the weirdest, coolest markers, because they had like the brush tip on one side and the other side was like a thin tip that you can like color like smaller spaces with.
Right.
So it was just an experience for a lot of people. Like, oh wow, like these are artist markers too. And it's like, how often do you see artist markers in law school?
Yeah, you got to be creative in law school. That's amazing. So, Haley, our time is running down. How can people? So you have a website. Like, how can people get in touch with you? And like, what's your website? Your website's pretty cool.
You can. All right. So you can follow at haleymoss.net. I'm also on all major social media. So I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Haley Moss Art. I usually post about autism, neurodiversity, different disability rights stuff, things that I find interesting. And because I do a lot of consulting and public speaking, and now I'm doing more webinars and virtual stuff too, I'll always share information about what's available for you guys, whether it's online or I'm traveling or whatever is going on, because I love getting to talk to people. I love getting to educate people. I love getting to empower people. And everything is at Haley Moss Art, because I signed up for social media when I was a teenager and the art always stuck in my name. And I'm trying to actually draw some more pictures and things to get to post and paint more, so then I can have some more color and excitement on your feed too.
Awesome. That's so great. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing all that wonderful information. It's so impressive. And I wish we had a little longer to talk. Please say hello to your parents for me. They seem like lovely people.
I will.
And is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
I think we covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure there's definitely more we can cover in the future.
Yeah.
But thank you again for having me, and
course.
looking forward to continuing this great conversation.
Awesome. So everybody, wherever you are in the world today, enjoy yourselves and be safe out there and stay well. Cheers.
The Lawyer Stories podcast is produced by Marketing the Law. Are you looking at your social presence every day? Potential clients are. Learn how to magnetize your brand with the help of Marketing the Law. Find us on Instagram at Marketing the Law to learn more.